Good afternoon and welcome to All About Animals. I'm Sherry Graditor, and this is a very special show for me because All About Animals has entered into its 30th year constantly on the air without interruption. It's a long time. We are estimating, and the shelters estimate, that we've had approximately 10,000 adoptions of dogs and cats through the show. And that's a heck of a legacy, and I intend to keep going for a long time. But the question that I'm asked more than any other question as I do this and as I have done this is, how do you stand it? How do you not burn out when you hear the stories, the tragic stories? The man who walks into a shelter and says, "Take my animal or I'm going to kill it." The dog that's taken away from an owner because it's been starved or beaten or burned or abused, the cat that's been tortured. Being in shelters, dealing with animals for these many years, there have certainly been lots and lots of horror stories. And not just horror stories, there are also the sad stories, the bad stories. I'm moving and I'm not going to take my animal. And I waited until the day before I was moving, and now there's nothing I can do with it. Where that animal was eminently placeable had the person, when he knew he was moving, taken responsibility for his pet. Or a man I remember from many years ago who wanted to adopt a beautiful little long-haired dachshund. The dog was about 5 years old. And the man said to me, "Now I'm only going to be in the Chicago area for 5 years." I said, "And then what will you do with the dog at the end of 5 years?" He said, "I'll bring it back. You can find it another nice home." And I said, in 5 years, that dog will be 10 years old, and 80% of the people who come out to adopt won't even be willing to look at it. I won't allow you to adopt that animal. The man threatened to sue me, told me I was being discriminatory. He thought it was perfectly okay to get a pet and keep that pet for his children for a 5-year period, then deprive the pet of its home, make it adjust to a new owner, deprive his children of the home. This was a commodity to be purchased, held for a period of time, as long as it was convenient, and the minute it became inconvenient, this was a purchase that was to be disposed of. And he wanted to be sure that we would take it back, so that he had adequate disposition arranged even before he took the animal home. And he couldn't understand why I thought this was wrong. As far as I'm concerned, animals are not disposable goods. They are loving creatures. They are part of a family. I call my dogs my fur babies, my cats also. I've always had skin babies and fur babies. And I kind of almost treat them the same way, although there are people that say that I overindulge my dogs or cats as I overindulge my children. There are things that have made it worthwhile over the years. Lovely, loving stories. And I decided today a couple of those wonderful stories I would like to share with the people who watch the show. The first, and probably the best, was a dog that came in to save a pet. Her name was Fifi. She was 21. She was a little poodle. She had no hair. She had no teeth. So as you held her sideways, kind of the tongue would fall out in front, to the side, wherever there was no cage of teeth to hold it in. She was hairless. She was virtually blind. She could hear. People at Save a Pet put her into, and her owner had died and no one would take her because she was old. Put her into the puppy kennel, which is warmer and isolated and much quieter, but she could hear the big dogs barking and she was terrified. And she laid on a blanket in this small cage, shaking all day and all night. It was late November when I taped the show, and she was my special needs dog of that week, and I said, "This is Fifi," and Fifi is old and frail. Nobody wants her. She is alone in a cage. She hears the big dogs barking, the people walking. She can't see. She's terrified. She shakes. And she's cold because she has no fur. And she will live alone in that cage, alone and terrified. Christmas is coming. She will pass Christmas alone and terrified in that cage, and alone she will die. Christmas Eve morning, a man walked into the shelter with 3 small children. Said, I hope Fifi's been adopted. They said, sir, no one's going to adopt that little dog. And he said, you're wrong. He said, my children have asked me to return all of their Christmas gifts and take the money and adopt Fifi so that she has a place to live and people to love her until she dies. And he adopted that little dog. And about 6 months later, he sent a letter to the shelter thanking the shelter for allowing his kids to learn about loving and loss and allowing him to learn how wonderful his children were. It's a story I think of and I smile and I can't help it because those kids were wonderful and so was their dad. Or another one was 2 young men who came in and they were looking for 2 dogs to adopt as jogging companions. They lived in Lincoln Park. And there was a very old Great Dane with terrible hip dysplasia. You'd tell him to sit, he would try to sit and he would kind of fall down. He was covered with fatty tumors. He was old. And they said, what's with the old Great Dane? And I said, sir, the dog can hardly walk and he's large. And probably he's not going to be adopted. And they said, we want that dog. But you're looking for jogging companions. Come on now, the dog can't walk. And he said, we'll adopt 1 dog to share, to jog with. And we'll take that old guy home. And they made him a bed in a bay window in the front of their condo. And 3 times a day, the 2 guys together, one would take the front, one would take the back, and they'd carry that dog down the stairs and hold him up so he could urinate and defecate, and then carry him back up and put him back in his window so he could watch the world go by. And the dog lived that way until he died a graceful, peaceful death. And I'm so grateful to those 2 men for showing me how human people can be, how wonderful people can be. We had a dog at Save a Pet named Taffy. Taffy came in horrendous condition, profoundly, grossly obese. She'd lived on nothing but table scraps and garbage. She had 2 dislocated hips. She had, I'm trying to think of all of the problems she had a major kidney problem. She couldn't walk, she couldn't stand. Save a Pet took this dog and had surgery done on both of her hips, put her on a diet. In the beginning she couldn't get up, made her walk, had her on pain medication. She had a skin condition. She had all kinds of thyroid condition, I believe, too. All kinds of problems. And this is a dog that you would look at. She was not lovely. She wasn't even marginally pretty. But she had a lovely soul. And some man came in and saw through the eyes and saw the love in that dog's soul. And he adopted her and he took her home, and Taffy is now in a loving home. When I do a special needs animal, and I try to do one every time I tape, the people who watch the show have been generous. And every time I've ever done a special needs animal, that animal has gone home. There's somebody out there that's touched. And when I do an obstreperous puppy, or when I do a very shy dog that's been abused, some wonderful person comes up. Had a lady stop me in a pet shop and she said, you don't know me, but you had a 16-year-old cat on the show. And I went to Save a Pet, and I never would have considered a 16-year-old cat, but you said this was the sweetest cat there. She said, and I adopted him and I took him home, and I want to tell you, I'm grateful that you told me how wonderful he was, because he's the best cat I've ever owned, and I love him to pieces. There are those people out there who have made, every time I've been peed on by a dog, and every time I've been pooped on by a parrot, and every time I've tripped on the ice walking a dog outside, and all of the times that we travel hours to get to some wonderful, worthy, charitable organization that we want to show you, the time that it takes to schedule, the time that it takes to tape, and the pain that's caused by the animals we see who have not been well treated. It is you, the people who love animals, the people that I get to meet through the shelter or through the stories, the kinds of people whose stories I have just shared with you that have kept us going for 30 years and hopefully will keep us going for longer. We are now going to Save a Pet, and we'll show you some of the wonderful animals waiting there to be adopted.